So last weekend I got busy and I pulled the engine on my 210 Allis Chalmers. Actually, I pulled the head and all the top end off with it still in the tractor, and then I pulled just the short block out and made it a little easier to maneuver for me with as heavy as it is. So this weekend my goal is to get the short block torn down. I've ordered in a Reliance engine rebuild kit through our sources, new sleeve assemblies, bearings, gaskets. So hopefully when I get into this, I think I'm probably the first guy that's ever been in this motor from the looks of it, and we'll try to get the sleeves replaced and everything. It is quite worn. There's a lot of piston slap in this thing. Looks like just like a lot of hours, a lot of wear. I haven't found anything unusual.
So this is a tractor that my dad bought over a year ago. Here he's just getting through some of the teardown and getting some of the parts through the spray cabinet there so that we can get an idea of what's wrong with this engine.
How's it feel? It feels tight. A little bit of slop in it. The bearings are dated first month of '74. So I don't think they've ever been changed. I don't think anybody's ever been in here before.
So one broken ring so far?
Yeah, and kind of surprised me it's the second ring that's broke, not the first.
Yeah. So when we picked up this tractor, I think it was $500, and we didn't tell Mom that we were getting it. How are you feeling about that at this point?
Oh, you can never have too many tractors.
Okay, but we did buy this a year and a half ago, and you didn't really need a tractor, but this one needed a clutch. And you went through and did all of the clutch, right?
Yeah, we put a complete clutch assembly in it.
So that was last year. You were getting ready to farm with it, and we get out into the field and the engine is completely worn out.
Well, that one's not looking too bad. I've got one over here that has some electrolysis started in it. Actually not bad considering this thing's 50 years old.
So what'd you find on the rest of the pistons?
I found broken second ring on every single piston, and the two center pistons are scored up. I would guess the engine's probably been overheated at some point in time, and I think you kind of noticed that when you surfaced the head. It was warped a little bit, so everything indicates that it's been overheated. Not extremely bad, but hotter than it should have been.
So we didn't know the history of the tractor, but you didn't want to rebuild the whole engine if it didn't need it, so you did the clutch.
Yeah, and at that time we still didn't know if the transmission or the rear end was good on the tractor or what the hydraulics were like, so I don't really feel bad having done that, only to find out that now we have to do the engine.
So surprisingly, it looks like nobody had rebuilt this. Here we're showing the crankshaft that measured really, really well, but you can see some chatter marks on that we think is probably from the grinding wheel being out of balance when it was originally ground. So obviously, Dad, you grind most of the crankshafts, actually all of the crankshafts. I don't do any crankshaft grinding yet. Does something like that chatter have any effect on the way the crank actually runs?
In this case, I don't think it bothered the crankshaft one bit because it's ran all those years and shows no wear whatsoever on the crank or the bearings.
So in this case, it looks like it's purely cosmetic. Moving on to the connecting rods, the big ends of the rods seemed to measure just fine, right?
Yes, there's no problem with them whatsoever.
But here on the pin bushings, were definitely had some wear, so we're going to be pressing the old ones out and installing new pin bushings. So what's kind of the process on doing the pin bushings here?
Well, we'll press the old bushing out, press in the new pin bushing, and then we'll have to set the rod up on our pin boring machine and bore the bushing to the exact center-to-center distance on that rod to make it the correct length, so the piston comes out the right height at the top of the cylinder.
So getting set up here on the pin boring machine, can you kind of explain what the setup process is?
What I'm doing here is set the fixture to the correct inside diameter of the rod, and then once the fixture is set for the inside diameter of the rod, I can use the inside mic to adjust it for the correct center-to-center distance, so that when that rod is placed on there, raised up, and goes down across that little boring bar head there, it will cut it to the correct center-to-center distance.
So the other thing that you have to do, obviously, like you said, you have to have the fixture so it holds the rod and you get it set for the correct center-to-center length. but you're also setting that little cutter to the correct diameter using the pin of a piston there, and kind of, don't you basically just turn it around and let it push the cutter out of the way a little bit, and then...
Yeah, you leave the cutter just kind of loose in there, just barely snug, and once the pin is in that fixture, you run the boring head backwards, and as it comes across that fixture, it'll push the cutter back to the exact distance it needs to bore that size.
But then you also can do a little bit of a fine adjustment, right? And you want to obviously shoot for a little bit smaller first.
Yes, there's if you look to the right-hand side of that little boring head, there's an adjustment screw there that you can change that diameter in 1/10,000th increments.
So another thing that you're kind of showing there is sneaking up on it, because you always want to make sure that you're not cutting too big right away and ruining the bushing, and it's kind of a double check of the length as well, because if you're too short or too long, you're also going to ruin the bushing. And then you'll hone it to the finished size to get your correct clearance on that pin bushing to the pin.
Right. We'll rough bore it, get it within a couple thousandths of finished size, and then do the actual finish on the sun and rod hone.
So in this case, it's pretty similar to resizing rods. Finish honing out the rest of that material. I think it looks like on the gauge you came in around 1.8 thousandths clearance, maybe? Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I don't remember the spec on that now without going back and looking at it, but that sounds about like what the correct clearance should be on a rod that size, on a pin bushing that size.
So this engine is kind of different than a lot of the stuff that we see in our shop, because being one of these agricultural diesel engines, it has the wet sleeves, so we're not boring the block. There's really not a whole lot of machine work that we did on this, aside from going through the head, doing the rods, and maybe one or two other things. So you basically just got everything cleaned up and got some new parts for it. So moving on to putting the cam bearings in, is there a reason you're working on the floor there, or?
Well, the reason I'm working on the floor is because I don't have an engine well, I do have an engine stand that would hold that engine, but I didn't have the brackets to be able to mount it on the stand, and this being a one-time deal, I just didn't feel like taking the time to build brackets, so I thought, you know what, I've got a brand new clean rug here on the floor, I'll just build it there.
And not that I think it's going to get any dirt in it doing it that way, but at least if it did, it's our own engine and not somebody else's, right?
That's right. Be our own problem.
Yep. With our location being out in kind of a rural area of Colorado, we do see a lot of these types of engines, but normally it's one of the mechanics who's bringing us the parts who is rebuilding it. So we're usually doing just the head, or, you know, in some instances we'll do the lower bore repairs on like the John Deere blocks. But a lot of the time, you know, we're not really doing the assembly on these bigger engines, which is honestly really nice, because it's kind of a pain.
It takes a lot of time to build an engine and build it right, paying attention to detail. And these engines like this are designed to be rebuilt by the mechanic or the farmer out in the field. And unless they've had some kind of catastrophic failure, it is a matter of just changing the wet sleeves and rolling some bearings back in on the crankshaft, and away you go again.
So it looks like there you kind of went through, separated the pistons and the sleeve assembly so that you could get the pistons on the rods, kind of measured the pistons, measured the sleeves, and then going on to getting them installed in the block. Is there anything special to this? Because it looks like you really don't weigh enough to be using all your body weight there, because it looks like they're still going in kind of tough. What do you have to say?
Actually, these went in, I thought, really nice. I have a bottle of tire lube soap that I've always used on the O-rings, coat the bottom bore of the block there and the O-rings, and then just a little bit of steady pressure downward, and the sleeves generally slide right in.
Just a little bit different than using a BFH on the press fit sleeves like we do in a automotive block.
Yes, it is.
So it looks like you've moved up onto the bench here, so you're kind of working at a nicer level, not bent over on the ground. Got some pig mats laid out there to keep everything clean, and getting the main bearing set in place and lubed up so you can get the crankshaft in. Aren't you glad you have that hoist?
Yeah, I don't know how a guy can work in a shop without having the hoist, or certainly work by yourself. And for the most part, most of the years that we've been out here in this location, I've been by myself, and that hoist has saved my back.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you have it, because I already have a bad back, and I'm only 25, but that hoist makes it nice. We can move from the crank grinder to the spray cabinet and all over every corner of the shop pretty easily. So it looks like you got the thrust washers in there, kind of working on getting the main cap set into place. What are you doing here?
Setting the thrust cap. You need to bump the crankshaft back and forth with the thrust cap slightly loose, and it'll line the sides of the cap. I always want to make the last bump towards the front, because that's the direction when you press on the clutch, that it's always pushing the crank into that thrust washer. So you want to make sure that side of the thrust bearing is lined up real well.
And you're lucky. I saw the part in the clip where you missed and almost took off the corner of the block with that hammer. So I cut that out so that YouTube wouldn't see it. And now you're getting everything torqued down here. Looks like we're moving on to installing the connecting rods on the pistons. Anything special there?
No, just a little bit of assembly lube inside the piston and the bushing, a little bit on the pin, slip that all together, make sure the piston is on the rod the correct direction, and then put the snap rings in, make sure they're fully seated, and everything looks good. It's ready to put in.
So I don't remember how many days it took, but you were kind of working this in between normal work and working after hours, and we're still trying to get our new building put together, so things have been pretty busy around here, but it looks like we kind of stretched across multiple days here. Here we're getting some of the rod bearings set into place and getting everything blown off real well. From the looks of it, you prepped the cylinders and then moved on to the next day. Must have been getting everything back installed in the block here.
Yeah, it looks like probably ran out of day before I ran out of work. And so this is obviously the next day putting the pistons in the block.
So you've got that ring compressor there, and then kind of pulling them back into place. You've got the caps lubed up there so that you've got lube on the bearings. What are you doing with the hammer there?
Well, again, just like the thrust on the crank, I'll bump the rod forward and backward to line the cap on the rod as well as I can before I torque it down.
So if you didn't have those bolts holding down the sleeves, would they be moving?
There is a chance that as you roll that engine over, the friction of the piston and rings in that cylinder could be enough to push the sleeves back up out of the block. So you always have to just put a bolt with a washer over the top edge just to hold it in place while you're assembling the short block.
Looks like you're getting everything torqued down. Always the worst feeling when you go to bed after building an engine and you think to yourself, man, did I torque the rod bolts?
Yeah, a lot of that stuff goes back through your mind.
So what's this? What are you getting put on there?
That's the front plate assembly for the engine. Also acts, those flanges out on the side is what mounts this engine into the frame of the tractor. This holds all of the timing gears. On the right hand side there where I'm turning that, right there is the hydraulic pump. That gear I'm dropping in is just an idler between the crank gear and the injection pump, and it has a couple of Timken bearings in there, has to be torqued down tight.
So these are all reused, right? All these gears?
Yeah, I didn't change any of the gears in it. They all looked real nice. We did have the camshaft reground. It was showing quite a bit of wear. That was done by Delta Cam out in Tacoma, Washington. They always do a real nice job for us.
And we'll show that here in a little bit. There you're getting, must be the oil pump and everything put on.
Putting the oil pump back in. I didn't replace it. Everything inside it looked real nice, so I didn't feel there was any reason it needed to be replaced.
So how do you remember where all these parts go?
Well, they just kind of fall together as you go. I always lay the parts out before I start so I can kind of tell what we need to be putting back in.
So there we're showing the cam and the tappets, and they weren't terrible, right?
That was actually the old stuff we was showing there.
Right.
That was showing the wear on it. This is the cam after it came back from being reground. You could not tell this from a brand new cam. They do a super job on those. Had to install the timing gear back on the cam. It is a press fit, so I'll heat that gear up, expand it just a little bit, and then put it on the rest of the way with the press. Checking the backlash in the gears.
Yeah, it's a scientific, feels good, right?
Well, you could measure that, but I've done enough of these, kind of have a pretty good feel for it, and knowing that this one was running fine before there were not any issues with timing gears. So
we got it painted there, and there's Mom helping helping guide this thing back in. So what's your process here? You gotta get it all lined up, and
well, you have to get it back as close as you can and start it back on the input shaft of the transmission there, get the clutch all lined up and slip that back in. And needed one more hand, so Mom got volunteered to come help that day.
Yeah, this probably some evening when I wasn't here, or on the weekend when I was at home. So looks like you're getting the tractor put back together there.
Yeah, that weight on the front of that tractor I think is probably every bit as heavy as the engine itself.
And here we're getting the cylinder head set back on after being rebuilt. So I wanted to show setting that in place, and sure enough, we did actually go through the entire head. That's probably the bulk of the machine work we did on this entire engine. So started with, getting it torn apart and cleaned, pulling the seats out of it, which I do by running a little bit of the TIG welder around the seat, and that'll make them get real hot, and then they shrink and kind of come right out, usually. Obviously gave it the MagnaFlux treatment to make sure it's not cracked, and get it up on the RMC 1000 and get it surfacing. And like we said earlier in the video, you can see 4/1000ths off of it, and it still had a couple cylinders there in the middle that were not cleaned up, but got it 7/1000ths total off of it, which isn't nothing, but it's also not crazy warped. So looks like some of the guides didn't want to come out without being drilled, so I cut the top off the guides and then drilled partway down through with the core drill there, and that leaves a step that I can go in with the air hammer and drive the guide on out. Then I'm getting them prepped for the new guides, spraying some press fit lube on them, and I kind of tap them in with the rubber hammer there. It's actually a dead blow, and get them straight before moving over to the sun and press, where we can press them in. And I've got a little spacer there set up so that we press them into the correct height. I believe the intake and the exhaust are at different heights on this. Touched them up with the guide hone there before driving in the new intake and exhaust seats. And one thing we like to do on these older heads is cut them for positive Viton valve stem seals. So that's what we're doing right here, is cutting them down a little bit, probably to what size seal did we use on those?
I think that was a 562 OD on the guide top.
Then over here on the Surdy, we have to cut the seats to make sure that the new valve seat is concentric to the new valve guide. Obviously, we want a valve seat that's concentric and is going to seal well. So going in and cutting them. I don't remember, do you remember what the angles and the widths were on this?
I believe this engine has 30-degree seats on intake and exhaust, and I think we made them 1.5 millimeter wide.
It sounds about right. You can tell there by the way it cut that the exhaust was a little bit harder than the intake seat, but it's been a long time since I did this. I don't remember anything too crazy on them. Obviously checking all the valve depths to make sure we have the specified protrusion, and double checking that our vacuum seals. So obviously it's always nice to see that when you turn that vacuum off, it holds pretty steady there on the gauge. and you hear that pop when you pull the vacuum gauge off. So it looks like we're getting everything laid out here. We went with all new valves, all new springs, and everything on this, right?
Yeah, it's all new hardware all the way through.
Yeah. So we always grind the valves too, even when they're brand new, just to make them make sure that they're nice and good, because we have more confidence in our machine than some of the factory equipment. Getting the positive Viton valve sim seals installed. Those went on a little bit hard for some reason. I had to use the hammer there. I don't usually like to do that, but going ahead and getting the valve springs installed with the new keepers, everything went together pretty well on this head. It's really, I mean, it's pretty simple there. There's not much to it, and it sure looked pretty when it was done. I always like when they come out nice like that. I'm assuming this is something you did, because those don't look like my hands.
It will in a few years. No, we refaced the tips of the rocker arms. The inside bore of the rocker and the shaft were in relatively good condition, so we didn't replace anything there. But the tips of the valves where they contact, or tips of the rocker where they contact the valves, were worn, so we faced those.
So you had to make a little extension crow's fit there to torque the head down, because some of the bolts are under the rocker shaft.
Yeah, it's kind of a strange setup the way they did this, that there's one row of head bolts directly under that rocker shaft, and the rocker shaft actually is bolted down with head bolts. So have to make either come up with or make a special little wrench there and then adjust your torque setting to compensate for that, and get it all torqued down to the right spec.
And we're getting a little ahead now, but it looks like you were using an indicator to set your valve lash.
Yeah, I've found it, rather than trying to use a feeler gauge, a lot of times you can stick a dial indicator up there and measure actually how much lash you have there, and makes it real easy to set it, and very accurate.
So here you're getting the rest of the tractor put together and getting your fluids put in. Anything complicated there?
No, just time consuming. Look like here I'm getting ready to fire it up the first time. There it goes. First smoke.
So did you think it was going to start on the first try right like that?
I didn't think it was going to start and run that smooth. In fact, I got the thing fired up and I drove it outside right away, so I could run it up, keep the RPMs up a little bit, and not fill the shop with smoke. It was getting kind of late in the evening there. Wanted to get it running before I quit for the day.
And you did run driven diesel break-in oil.
Yeah, I used driven diesel break-in oil. The instructions on that says you can run it if it's an over-the-road truck, I believe. Was it 1,000 miles we read on that? So I was going to leave that in probably 8 hours or so before I change it. This is first time out in the field.
So yeah, got it running and got the chisel on there and running through the field for the first time. How did it feel?
Felt really good. Yeah, felt real good to have that behind me.
Yeah, definitely relieving. I mean, you've definitely got a hell of a lot more than $500 in it at this point, right?
Oh yeah, we're up into the thousands, but we won't tell Mom that.
She doesn't need to know, and she only watches some of my videos, so we're good to go.